Welcome to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for an unfiltered discussion of Arab-Israeli affairs and the U.S. role in that vital world arena. I'm your host today, Helena Cobban, and this show is a project of the CNI Foundation, which works for fair U.S. policies in the Middle East and fair discussion of those policies here in America. Find out more about CNI at our website, www.cnionline.org, or on our new blog, Fair Policy, Fair Discussion. My guest today is Rami Khouri, a very well-known Palestinian Jordanian writer and analyst who is also, I believe, a U.S. citizen. Rami is currently the director of the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. Before that, he was the executive editor of the Beirut Daily Star, and he still publishes a regular column there that is syndicated internationally through Agence Globale. Rami Khouri is talking with us from Beirut today. Welcome, Rami, and thanks for being with us. It's great to have you here.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
How's the weather there in Beirut?
The meteorological weather is great, and the political weather is also quite pleasant compared to what it's been in recent years, so no complaints for the moment.
Well, great. We're still living through a big freeze here, and it's meteorological, and it feels a little bit political, but we'll get into that, too. Before I get to my first question, I just want to remind listeners that later in the show we'll be opening the lines to callers. So, Rami, my first question to you. Here we are, nearly 1 year after Barack Obama's historic inauguration. What difference do you think at this point his being president has made for the peoples of the Middle East?
Generally speaking, I think a year after Obama's inauguration, we can say that he hasn't made much difference yet. He has certainly changed the rhetoric of the United States. He has made a few policy moves that are different than what George Bush was doing, but beyond the realm of rhetoric and a few limited moves, he really hasn't gotten into the substantive changes that one would have expected from what he was saying during the campaign and in the first couple of months of his presidency, when he was pushing very hard on the theme of change and a new way of diplomacy, etc. But a year later, it seems that it's more talk than action, and there's still a little bit of ambiguity about whether this is going to stay like this. In other words, what we see is what we get, or whether he's actually holding back on Middle Eastern issues because he's more preoccupied with other things. We really don't know that yet.
Yeah, I guess some people think it's due to him being very busy with health care or whatever. Some people actually are now writing about his Middle East policy, that he seems to be kind of falling back into the Bush mode, and you know, that it's very difficult to say that there's been any difference from Bush to Obama. But, you know, that's the talk around here in Washington, D.C. When we were in the Middle East, we found a lot of real disappointment from people who'd had such high hopes at the time of his inauguration. Is that something you get as you travel around the Middle East?
Oh, yes, very much. I think there is disappointment because he really raised expectations, and he raised expectations through rhetoric, through certain acts like going to Cairo and making a dramatic speech in Cairo, sending a message of New Year greetings to the Iranian people, and starting to negotiate with Iran, resuming the full diplomatic contacts with Syria, demanding that Israelis freeze settlements. He naming George Mitchell, he made moves that were substantive, though narrow in their scope, but they were substantive moves. And with the rhetoric and the body language, which he started doing during his inauguration speech, it was from the first moment, literally the first moment of his presidency, he started doing this. So he raised expectations really high. We have to assume that he was sincere. This is not a man who goes around just whimsically saying things. He's very smart, he's deliberate, he's a strategic thinker. He must have been sincere when he said all these things. Now, why he changed course, it's still a little bit unclear, but clearly we can tell some things. The Israelis obviously put their foot down, and he couldn't budge them because of the pro-Israeli forces in the U.S. that threatened to make him a one-term president if he goes too far. He couldn't get anything out of the Arabs either. He tried to get Arab gestures of coexistence or confidence building, whatever, with Israel. He couldn't get anything from the Arabs either. He wasn't prepared to push too hard on Arab-Israeli issues while he was still preoccupied with domestic issues in the U.S. He had Iraq going, Afghanistan. There's a lot of different things on his plate. So what are exactly the reasons why he didn't push further? We really don't know. And, when I talk to people who are in or close to his administration who are involved in Middle East policymaking, I get different stories. So this is very much a issue that is still in the making, I think. I don't think we've seen the full Obama Middle East policy yet. I don't think he's articulated it, and I think there is still more to come. It may be better, it may be worse. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, I guess some people are saying here that he didn't expect such a heavy pushback from Netanyahu, in particular on the settlements issue, which would be strange if he didn't expect that, because, you go back to Shamir, you go back to everybody in the Likud, the right, as they claim, to settle the whole of Judea and Samaria has always been central to what they think about and their self-definition. So, if he didn't expect that pushback, I think that's kind of a failure.
Well, I think it's the one area where I think we are seeing a bit of amateurism, or let's just call it lack of experience. This is hardball, and so Obama has never played hardball in the Middle East. He's played softball, and this is the learning experience for him. This is on-the-job training. He did better on, I think, health policy. I think he's done better on economic revival. There's areas where he's done a little bit better, but he's still learning. I mean, the stuff that he had on his plate was extraordinary, what he had to deal with and the major issues. There's 8 or 10 major issues, domestic and global, and he couldn't possibly deal with them all at once. And clearly the Middle East, after naming Mitchell and making the, hug a Muslim policy, love Iran, etc., after this lovey-dovey rhetorical approach to the Islamic world, and naming Mitchell, he basically backed off because the political price was too much for him. But he clearly must have known that there was going to be pushback from the Israelis. I think he probably thought that they could overcome it, but they didn't, and they probably didn't have a plan B in place. So they just pulled back, and we'll see. They're still working on it. I mean, this is not an issue that has been thrown out the window. There's contacts going on. There's talks going on. There's all kinds of things happening in the region. There's tremendous diplomacy going on among the Arabs in the region. Negotiations between Hamas and Israel. The Turks are revving up, and there's still a lot of behind-the-scenes action. And I think we're going to see the Middle East coming back onto the agenda in the spring at some point. It may be in a much more difficult context, though, because as we see in Yemen now, things are becoming more complex and more dangerous for many people, especially for the Yemenis. So the lesson of the Middle East is that if you wait, things are probably going to get worse for everybody. And the people of the Middle East are the ones who suffer first.
When we were there recently on our CNI trip and we went to all the countries of, Israel and all of its neighbors, one thing that really struck me was the precariousness of the situation in Jerusalem, where you have the settlers now. I mean, an activist settler organization undertaking excavations right under the Muslim quarter of the old city. When we were in Damascus, one of the leading intellectuals there said to us, you need to understand that when a Muslim blows himself up in Afghanistan, quite frequently he's thinking about Jerusalem. I don't know whether that's an exaggeration to say that, but clearly, the Jerusalem issue and the Gaza issue are ones that have resonance far beyond the Arab world these days.
Well, they do, and I think that it's true that people all over the world who see themselves as fighting back or resisting or defying American colonialism, as they would call it, or neocolonialism or imperialism, are reacting to what they see as unacceptable policies, whether those policies are carried out by the United States, by Israel, by their own governments in the Arab world or Asia, wherever it may be. clearly the policies that the Israelis and the Americans and the Arab autocratic leaders pursue, or leaders in Afghanistan or Pakistan or other places, these policies elicit a reaction. And the reaction
I'm afraid
sometimes
I need to break in just there because we're coming toward a station break. You know, we were talking about how it's been 1 year since Obama's inauguration, and there's also another anniversary that we're somewhat painfully living through these days, which is, of course, the anniversary of the Israeli war on Gaza last year. You recently wrote a great piece in which you said that of the 7 goals Israel's leaders had at that time when they launched the war, 1 was unachievable and the other 6 were not achieved. Could you describe that argument for me a bit more?
But, you know, most of what Israel wanted to do in the attack on Gaza was to defeat, to hurt, and to damage the Palestinians so badly that they would never, ever again think of resisting or defying or fighting Israel and its occupation and colonization policies, and they wanted to bludgeon it into submission and to get all the other Arabs to follow suit. And it just doesn't work that way. What happens when you occupy people or colonize them or degrade them or lay siege to them or starve them or whatever is they fight back. And this is human nature. This is nothing about Palestinians or Arabs. The one main reason that the Israelis said they launched the war, which was a complete non-credible hoax, was to stop what they called the rocket fire from Gaza. But the rocket fire had stopped twice with ceasefires that Hamas and Israel had negotiated. So the Israelis had mechanisms that worked to prevent any attacks from Gaza. And these aren't rockets. They use the word rockets. They're large firecrackers. They're small projectiles that are mostly wander aimlessly into the desert. I mean, I think 2 or 3 Israelis were killed over the last 4 or 5 years with these small projectiles that are, you know, made in people's garages, essentially, where over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed over the last 10 years in Israel attacks on Gaza. So the main excuse the main reason the Israelis give is completely non-credible. The other attempts that it made to get the Palestinians to give in to Israeli demands and to have them accept the Israeli conditions for negotiations are not working, and the Palestinians are more determined in their resistance, and there's global now pressure on the Israelis to the point where the Israeli officials, including 2 days ago, some, I think, foreign defense ministry officials, are afraid to go to London because they don't want to get sent to court to be tried for war crimes. So while Israel has laid siege to Gaza, what has happened is politically, most of the world has now laid siege politically to Israel. Israel is under siege politically, and the climax of that was the Goldstone report. The Goldstone report by the UN Human Rights Commission was an incredibly important document because it came out of the United Nations system. It had legitimacy. Goldstone is a man of tremendous respect. There's probably isn't a single jurist in the world who has more respect and credibility than Richard Goldstone. And he was asking that both the Israelis and the Hamas investigate themselves. It was a balanced, even-handed report that demanded that both sides be held accountable according to the same rules of
in response
international law.
To his report and those, as you say, very balanced recommendations, I mean, he got completely trashed. I don't know if you were in this country at the time, but the kind of names that Richard Goldstone was getting called were unbelievable. I mean, you know, he was...
Yes. Of course.
Described as a self-hating Jew, and
right.
You know, like it
right. But these are the tactics that the pro-Israeli groups and the Israeli right uses because it's a reflection of the hysteria that defines most of the pro-Israeli lobby groups and the think tanks in Washington and others who are not used to having Israel subjected to the same standard of accountability by morality or by law. And they don't know how to handle it. You know, this is what they did to Jimmy Carter when he wrote his book about the occupation, to Mearsheimer and Walt when they wrote about the Israeli lobby. So the Israelis are in a bit of a dilemma. They still have tremendous support. Everybody in the world supports the security of the State of Israel, but most people around the world now are opposing the colonization of the State of Israel.
And I think most people want to see a resolution that is based on international law, not on colonial aggrandizement and sort of might is right. And I think, in a sense, Goldstone played into that because I know I did all this research on South Africa, and he played a huge role there in holding a mirror up to the white supremacists, the people who had kept the apartheid system in place, holding a mirror up to them and saying, look, this is what your policies did. And he did that as the head of a, government-mandated investigatory commission. And he really kind of forced white South Africans to look at themselves in the mirror and understand the violence and brutality on which their apartheid system was based. And I think that's what maybe the right-wing Israelis are terrified of now, that as a Jewish person, as a self-confessed Zionist, when he holds that mirror up to them, maybe it's going to cause a kind of a crumbling of self-confidence amongst the right-wing pro-settler forces in Israel in the same way that it did amongst the white forces in South Africa.
Right, I agree. And it's not just first of all, I think the fact that he's Jewish is totally irrelevant. The fact that he's an international jurist who has a tremendous track record is what's really significant. And he's asking both sides.
Well, that's significant for you and me, Rami, and for many people around the world. But I think for Jewish Israelis and for, the supporters of Israel around the world, the fact that he is Jewish and says he's been a long-time Zionist, I mean, I think that's actually very important. In the same way that when he did the thing in South Africa, he was speaking as a white South African.
I hope so. I mean, the point is he raises important moral and legal issues, and the world needs to respond to those. And the critical thing about what he did in his investigation with his colleagues is he held the Israelis and the Palestinians accountable to the same standards. And this is all we're asking. We're not asking for more rights than the Israelis. We want the Israelis and the Palestinians to be treated equally according to the law. And just to get back a moment to what you said before, people in Afghanistan and other places around the world do things. They're looking at Jerusalem. Combination of what Israel has been doing in its occupation since 1967 in colonization terms, and the attack on Gaza and the attack on Lebanon 2 years ago, this resonates deeply with people all over the region.
All around the world. Rami, I just want to bring in our first caller here. Nice to have Adam with us from New York. Adam?
Sure. First, I just want to tell Rami Khouri that your work is fantastic and really appreciate your contribution. I just wanted to kind of get your evaluation of how much Hezbollah, in terms of the political system in Lebanon, has been brought into the mainstream, and whether you see that as depending on what your evaluation is, whether you see that as an example of how we can apply that to other groups, specifically in terms of Israel and Palestine with Hamas.
Great question, Adam. Thanks so much.
Hezbollah is a very important group to understand, as is Hamas. The reality of Hezbollah is that since the early 90s, they've been getting involved in internal Lebanese politics, while they've also been carrying out their primary mission, which is resistance to Israeli aggression and any foreign aggression that they see. The critical element now is that Hezbollah clearly has been moving into the government system, playing the political game, while continuing to do its resistance. I think they understand that in the long term, they have to shift into a political strategy, and they have to be involved in domestic politics as well as regional politics in a more consistent way. That resistance is not a long-term vocation. They have to be involved in domestic issues, and they're looking at economics, etc. And this is a really tough transition. They haven't done a lot of this, and they're still learning how to do it. But this is something that people do all over the world. Look at just yesterday, we had the news that the Unionists in Northern Ireland, it was officially confirmed that they had all their weapons had been destroyed or decommissioned. And so that kind of transition takes place in the ANC in South Africa. This is a common process. There's nothing unusual about this.
And actually, right now, the U.S. is offering it to moderate elements within the Taliban. They offer it to everybody, but they don't seem to offer it to Hamas.
Right, and this is interesting because I think one of the patterns that I notice is that American policy often becomes sensible around the world, not everywhere. It often becomes more sensible, except when it has to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict. When the Israeli interests are at play, the American foreign policy tends to remain slightly irrational, inconsistent, and often hypocritical. And this is a real...
I need to kind of come in here. I'm really sorry. But that's a really important point that, our policy becomes irrational. Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host today, Helena Cobban, and with me is Palestinian writer and analyst Rami Khouri. I want to come right back, Rami, and talk about Hamas a little more, as our last caller did. Do you think it came out of the war of last year's war strengthened just by having survived it, or has it also been subjected to continued weakening because of the siege?
I think actually both. Like Hezbollah after the 2006 war in Lebanon, it gained a lot of support from people who were impressed by the fact that it was able to withstand the massive Israeli attack and to keep firing back, even just symbolic small projectiles, or in Hezbollah's case, larger rockets, just that symbolic ability to keep fighting back. In other words, the Israelis were not able to destroy the rocket launchers of Hamas or Hezbollah, and this is a small but significant point in the willingness and ability now of Arab groups to resist and to keep fighting Israel, even if the fighting is not going to hurt Israel in any major way. They know that, but the resistance hurts Israel because it denies the Israelis the single thing that they want most, which is Arab acquiescence and compliance and obedience. And Hamas and Hezbollah have radically shattered the last 40 years of the Arab impotence in terms of fighting back against the Israelis. So in that respect, Hamas, I think, has gained a lot of support. But on the other side, the destruction of Gaza, like the destruction of Lebanon, was so enormous that it really makes them think twice about sparking another war. So in that respect, they are more limited now, I think, than they were before. But I think
you end up with a kind of mutual deterrence. Because the Israelis don't really want to fight another war in Gaza, I don't think. But let's come into our caller, Diane from Plymouth.
First of all, I'd like to thank Rami Khouri for his insightful reporting from the Middle East. And I would like to know what he knows about what is going on or has gone on with the Gaza Freedom Marchers and George Galloway's convoy of trucks that are attempting to take humanitarian aid to Gaza. There's been quite a lack of reporting in the U.S. media on this issue.
Oh, you're absolutely right about the lack of reporting here. Rami, tell us what you know. And thanks, Diane, for your call.
The marchers were trying in for the Pink Code group, led by Pink Code, was not able to get through except for a small number. I think about 100 were allowed in. A symbolic element. But Galloway's caravan of aid was able to get in finally yesterday and was extensively covered on televisions in this region of the Middle East. Not surprisingly, it wasn't covered in the United States. No.
Because I guess they had a little kind of confrontation with the Egyptian security forces. It looked as though...
Right, and there was a brief clash with some Palestinians and some Egyptian troops were fighting. I think a few people were killed, unfortunately. But the symbolic importance is that people keep trying to break the siege. And the siege is mainly by Israel, but the Egyptians are also keeping their side of the border very tightly closed, and this angers a lot of people in the Arab world.
Rami, that actually brings me to a question that I have, but I should leave it on the side for now. We have Jack from Eugene. I guess that's Eugene, Oregon, is that right?
Yeah. Since you brought up the South African example, I've observed that the lobby here and as many tentacles in the United States are becoming virtually hysterical about the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. The boycott movement in particular seems to be expanding almost exponentially, especially in response to the recent blockage of the Freedom March into Gaza. And I was wondering what your view of that was. And I also, I wondered what your view of the impact worldwide of the blockage by Egypt of this, and whether or not you thought it might be credible to extend the boycott movement to Egypt, particularly their tourist industry, since they blocked these tourists free passage and abused some of them. And I thought it might be quite a just extension to, something like no Gaza, no Giza.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Well, I don't think it's realistic that people will mount a secondary boycott against Egypt, and Egypt doesn't particularly care because as long as it gets American support, it probably feels it can do anything it wants. But I do think that as you mentioned, the international boycott and divestment movement is growing, definitely. It's not really hurting Israel in a major way yet, but the symbolic political importance of it is enormous because it is precisely equating Israel with South Africa. It's talking about Israeli apartheid and colonization. And the Norwegian International Fund that invests Norway's trillions of dollars.
Right, sovereign wealth fund, huge amount of money.
They pulled out their council voted to divest their shares in one Israeli company that was making surveillance equipment for what we call the apartheid wall, what the Israelis call the security barrier. And this is enormously important. When a Norwegian fund, a government fund, takes money out of Israeli shares for moral reasons, this scares the Israelis. So what you're seeing is the slow breakdown of this mythology of Israel as the wonderful country that only does good versus the Palestinians and the Arabs who are terrorists. And the world is basically saying to the Israelis, we support Israel, we will help Israel be secure, but we do not support Israeli colonization. And the critical point to remember is that the colonization that Israel practices in the West Bank is the longest colonization in the world now, and it is a direct result, the direct legacy of 19th century European colonialism in the Middle East, and it continues today. It's the only 19th century
and you would think that in
continues.
The 21st century we would have left all that behind, wouldn't you?
Well, exactly, but there's an uninterrupted flow from the late 19th century to the early 21st century of Israeli Zionists moving into land that is owned by Arabs. They either take it by force or in other ways.
Important point. I want to bring in Sarah. I'm not sure, Sarah, where you're from?
Michigan. Mr. Khoury, you stated that Arabs are starting to get disappointed with Obama and that the political price for him to go along with their demands was too much. During the campaign, Muslims and Arab Americans put up with his subservience to AIPAC right after he was nominated as a Democratic candidate, and they kind of put up with his distancing himself from his Muslim father. So now that he's continuing the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan and adding Pakistan and Yemen and keeping Guantanamo and further eroding civil liberties, my question is, how much worse should it get before the Arab and Muslim American community organizes itself to oppose him in a meaningful way?
Rami, do you have something to say to that?
To be fair to him, I think we need to give him a little bit more time, to be really fair to him. He's trying to do a lot of things at once. This is not a high priority for him. The Middle East is an area that he focused on. He talked a lot about it because it was instrumentally helpful to him in other things. He talked about, Islamic world issues and respecting Muslims and stuff like that because it was important for him to try to deal with Iran and Afghanistan more than Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. It wasn't because he, in his gut, feels that the Palestinians should not suffer the occupation they suffer. At least he hasn't said so. His focus on Middle East stuff is instrumental to help him in other places. He has to make it clear. I think we really should wait, give him another 6 months or so into the summer to find out how serious he is. If he's all bluff, then I think it would be absolutely normal for people to start organizing against him, but depending on what the alternatives are.
But of course, waiting till the summer, Rami, means that you're then getting into another election cycle. That great political scientist Bill Quant has done this work on how election cycles affect U.S. conduct of its foreign policy in this area. I mean, I don't see the summer of 2010 as being a time that Obama can take on the lobby, quite frankly.
Well, you're right. The point is that he's going to start paying prices out here in the region. I think people will become more and more disappointed with him. Some governments will start looking at alternatives. And he's dealing with a more complex situation, especially now with Yemen. And who knows what will happen in Pakistan and Somalia and other places. Egypt remains volatile under the surface. So circumstances may force him to come out more forcefully with a American policy that is more clear to everybody and more even-handed and more dynamic, more aggressive.
Let's say diplomatically aggressive is what we want.
Right, diplomatically active, activist.
Yeah. We're coming up to another station break. With me is Palestinian writer and analyst Rami Khouri, and I know that Maria from Oregon, is that Maria or Mariah?
Hi, it's Mariah. Thank you very much for taking my call. Israel has never honored its two conditions of admittance to the UN. One, to internationalize Jerusalem, and the other to honor the right of return for the over 4 million UN-registered refugees as a result of Israel's founding and ethnic cleansing. Shouldn't this be the grounding principle for our advocacy in the United States?
According to normal standards of politics, morality, and law, it should be. But the way that the United States deals with Israel doesn't follow normal standards of politics, morality, or law. It follows the distorted standards of brute power, which is that any American politician who goes against the mainstream interests of the Israeli government will lose his job or her job. As we know this from Chuck Percy and Paul Finley and
well, we certainly
know
that because Paul Finley, was one of the co-founders, along with Pete McCloskey, of our organization.
It's pretty clear. I mean, this is now out in the open in the United States. The pro-Israeli groups that most of whom are Jewish, but many of them are Christian fundamentalists. There's all kinds of groups who support Israel excessively, and they're very powerful, and they play the game according to the American rules, which is you lobby and you support people, you criticize people, and you help them win, and you make them lose. And this is perfectly legal in the United States. It's just that they do it better than anybody else. Therefore, the American government, with very, very few exceptions, public officials do not deal with Israel in the same way they deal with every other country around the world, including even people who fight the United States, like the Taliban or the insurgents in Iraq or the Viet Cong back in the 60s and 70s. The U.S. went and negotiated with them and made deals with them and made peace with them.
Even while the fighting was continuing, in the case
exactly.
of the Vietnam
conflict.
negotiations or with the Taliban right now. You're quite right. There is this sort of exception to... I want to actually come back to this question of lobbying because, that is one of the things that we do here at CNI. We have the two branches. The CNI does the lobbying, and we haven't, to be frank, we haven't done much recently, and we're just ginning up a new campaign. The CNI Foundation, which is sponsoring this radio show, is a public education outfit, doesn't do lobbying. But we've been having quite a bit of discussion at CNI on what strategy would be best to use here in the United States. So while I've got you on the line, Rami, I'd just love, to finish up the show to get some advice from you. We're trying to bring our government to a more responsible and fair-minded position, as you know. And we're trying to decide between focusing on the compelling humanitarian issues, like lifting the siege on Gaza or stopping the settlement building in Jerusalem or stopping the evictions of Palestinian families in Jerusalem or whatever, very urgent and compelling humanitarian issues, versus trying to bring the focus back to the big issue of ending the occupation, securing the final peace agreement. I mean, it's now been more than 18 years since the Madrid Peace Conference. That's gone on way too long, and everybody's been rushing around, doing this little minor portion of it or that little minor portion of it, and the interim agreement, and discussing, which road in Hebron the settlers should be able to use on a Saturday and which they can use on a Sunday. But people have lost focus on the big issue, the big issue, so how do we kind of meld maybe those two strategies of focusing on the immediate humanitarian issues and looking at the big issue? Love your advice on that.
Well, it's a big question. The humanitarian issues, unfortunately, don't resonate much. I mean, you're not going to get far with that in the United States, even though Americans are incredibly decent and humane and thoughtful people who are unbelievably generous in their philanthropy and assistance to people in humanitarian need. But this is not going to resonate much in the U.S. I think there's two basic approaches to lobbying. One, either you use power, which is what the Israeli lobby does. You have influence, you have power. You can make people lose their seats in Parliament and in Congress, or help them keep their seats, or you can destroy the public image of a person by simply attacking them and saying that they're anti-Semitic or they're anti-Israeli or they're pro-terrorism or something like that, which is one of the techniques they use. The lobby groups like yourselves who are trying to work for a fair American position that's fair to Israel, fair to the Arabs, two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, you don't have the power to do what the pro-Israeli lobby does. The other approach, I think, the only one that would work, is the one that would build on the South African model, which is to shame and isolate the Israelis and to heighten the public awareness of their apartheid-style policies and to make them a pariah state. The problem with that is that there's massive support around the world for Israel to exist as a Jewish state, partly because of the guilt of the Holocaust, partly because people feel it's just the right thing to do. There's many reasons why people support Israel, and so there's never going to be massive criticism of Israel, but to end Israel colonialism, I think, is possible, and this is what's happening now. People keep pointing out the apartheid-type policies that Israel is doing. And in England now, there's a new regulation that food that is imported from Israel has to be labeled if it's from settlements, from colonies that are illegal, or is it from Israel within its 1967 boundaries, which is perfectly fine. So a gradual building up of that approach, I think, slowly equating Israel with South African apartheid-style policies is more likely to have an effect, because that really hurts the Israelis, drives them nuts, and it will force them into a more accommodating position ultimately if it is perpetuated.
Yeah, I mean, I know in South Africa, the white South Africans, both the Afrikaner speakers and the English speakers, felt the sports boycott in particular because they were, they're so focused on cricket and rugby and stuff like that. And when the Springboks couldn't go and play, that was enormous for them. So there are probably symbolic things like that, not just symbolic, but things to say that what you're doing in the West Bank is not okay.
Right, of course, and this is starting to happen now because of the Gaza war, where many Israeli officials now, high officials, deputy prime ministers and ministers and army generals, will cancel trips to Europe because they don't want to get indicted. People will make arrest warrants for them and to try them for war crimes, and they're afraid of that. So this is a process that's starting to happen, and I think this is the way to keep going, to keep pushing to stop the colonial excesses of Israel, but to make it clear that the Arabs are prepared to live and coexist with a predominantly Jewish Israeli state within its 1967 borders, with a resolution of the Palestine issue. I think that's the only realistic
my big
approach.
question for you have about 20 minutes to 20 seconds to answer, is there still time for the two-state solution?
Yes, I think there is, but it needs much, much more vigorous and sustained external political mediation, and the U.S. is the only party right now that can do that. The Europeans show signs of stirring a little bit. The Turks have played a local, regional role that's important. But yes, I think it can be done. The majority of Israelis and Palestinians want to have two states, and that's a good starting point.
Rami, I'm going to have to go into the end of the radio show right now. Tell people that you've been listening to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host today, Helena Cobban, and we've been having a wonderful conversation with Palestinian writer and analyst Rami Khouri. Rami, it's truly been an honor to have you with us on the show today.
Thank you. My pleasure, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, and let's keep in good touch.
Good work.
Yeah, and let's keep in good touch.
Good work.
Yeah, and let's keep in good